Each year, roughly 56 million students attend schools in the United States. One of the most contentious issues we have as a nation is how to best educate those students. In school districts all throughout the country, many students are greatly underperforming. For instance, in Detroit, the percentage of kids scoring proficient at math and reading is far below the national average. In fourth grade math, only 4% scored at or above proficient. In fourth grade reading, only 5% scored at or above proficient. In 8th grade math, just 5% of students scored at or above proficient, and in 8th grade reading, only 7% of students scored at or above proficient. Let's face it, our public education system needs to be re-examined because it's leaving behind many of our vulnerable students, the ones who need a good education and a good job the most. And like it or not, school choice is unequivocally a part of this conversation. Over the last few years, the Trump administration has been trying to shine a light on this issue, particularly because it stands to improve outcomes for African American communities throughout the country. Now, I know when you hear people talk about what this administration is trying to do for black people, all you ever really hear is,
black unemployment's at an all-time low.
But many other issues, including school choice, have had the attention of this administration.
We're renewing our call on Congress to finally enact school choice now. School choice is a big deal. Because access to education is the civil rights issue of our time, and I've heard that for the last, I would say, year, but it really is. It's the civil rights issue of our time. The next step forward in building an inclusive society is making sure that every young American gets a great education and the opportunity to achieve the American dream. Yet for too long, countless American children have been trapped in failing government schools. To rescue these students, 18 states have created school choice in the form of opportunity scholarships. The programs are so popular that tens of thousands of students remain on a waiting list.
And school choice initiatives have been touted as potential solutions to eliminate disparities in educational performance. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak with an expert from the Cato Institute to address the issue of school choice, and believe me, this entire interview is worth watching. Let's just kind of jump in. Tell everybody who you are, what your background is, and kind of the work that you've been doing so far on addressing the issue of school choice.
Yeah, my name is Cory DeAngelis. I'm the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation, and I'm also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. And most recently, I'm also the executive director at the Educational Freedom Institute, where I do a lot of school choice research. I do a lot of exposing school choice hypocrites. And what I mean by school choice hypocrites is I have a map at the Educational Freedom Institute website of politicians who exercise school choice for their own kids by sending their own kids to private school either today or in the past, but then vehemently oppose school choice for less advantaged communities in the forms of school choice programs or charter school programs as well. And then I've also done a lot of academic research on the effects of school choice programs, either being a charter school or access to a private school through a voucher program. And I most importantly like to look at non-test score outcomes, because if you ask individual parents why they want school choice and why they pick a private school over their residentially assigned government school, a lot of the time they rank other things besides test scores at the top of their list, like safety and just the culture of the school and just feeling that one-on-one attention between the educator and their child. And then also moral education and character education. So I like to look at other types of outcomes, like whether you ended up pregnant as a teenager or even ended up committing crimes as an adult. And the overwhelming evidence on these types of topics find that access to additional educational options tends to lead to better non-test score outcomes for students, such as reducing crime, reducing teen pregnancies, increasing tolerance of others' views. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack here, but there's a ton of evidence out there that school choice produces these types of benefits, and it makes sense theoretically. You know, in the traditional school system, in most states, your students are residentially assigned to a particular school just based on where they live. And if they're not satisfied with that school, it's essentially, well, too bad. If you want to go to a different school, you have to pay for a private school out of pocket. Tough luck if you don't have enough money to do that. You don't get to take any of your money to the private school that goes to the government-run school. So there's not very many strong incentives for government-run schools to actually do a good job. So that we find benefits of school choice makes a lot of sense to me, and I think to a lot of others.
Yeah, it seems to, especially when we're talking about focusing on what should be the core focus of this issue, which is how do we improve educational outcomes for students rather than protecting the interests of the adults who teach them. Being that we now have data that shows that school choice dramatically improves those outcomes across all demos, what do you think is the biggest stumbling block in implementing more school choice options throughout the United States?
Well, it's concentrated interests and dispersed cost, right? This is the main issue with a lot of things that go through the political process, that we have an existing interest group, which is the teachers' unions, and they have a monopoly on the school system right now. And I don't blame them for wanting to protect the status quo. Anyone else would probably do something similar. If I owned a business and I can force everyone to shop at my business and not be allowed to shop anywhere else, I'd probably be really happy about that because it would be a really profitable enterprise. Similarly, if Walmart could force everybody to spend all of their food stamps at Walmart and not be allowed to and to make it illegal for people to spend their food stamps at Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, Walmart would be pumped about that. So I think this is a concentrated interest problem. And, it makes sense that monopolies like to stay that way. They like to stay monopolies. And, the teachers' unions benefit a lot from increased union dues if they have more teachers in the system. Administrators benefit from the status quo because we've seen increases in spending in the education system in the U.S. over the last half century. I think since 1960 we've increased per pupil spending, even after adjusting for inflation, by about 230% in real terms. I would also like to point out that even though it's benefiting the teachers' unions and administrators in the system, it's not necessarily benefiting teachers to have a monopoly on education, because this is essentially a monopsony in the labor market. There's essentially just one big employer in the K through 12 education system, and that's the government. And if you're a teacher, you only have pretty much one choice if you want to be a teacher, you pretty much only have one choice. That's the government school system. You essentially have to accept the benefits and the autonomy that they give you and the pay level that they give you. And also, if your school doesn't have a strong incentive to spend that additional money wisely, they're not going to spend it on the classrooms and the children and the teachers. They're going to spend it on administrative bloat and support staff, which increases union dues. So even though the status quo is benefiting the teachers' unions, I would argue that it's not benefiting teachers. And we do have data on this as well. Okay. There are 6 studies on the topic that I know of that link school choice competition to teacher salaries in public schools. And so in areas where additional school choice competition comes into play, the government schools start to pay their teachers more money. And that's, again, because they know that they're going to either lose their teachers or they know that they're going to lose students if they don't spend their money wisely. And what better way to improve educational outcomes than to spend the money wisely on teachers? And so Ben Scafferty's done a report on this at Kennesaw State University, and he actually found that between 1992 and 2014, real per pupil education spending in the United States increased by about 30%, but real teacher salaries dropped in real terms by 2%. So where's all the money going? It's not going to the teachers. It's going towards administrative bloat and support staff.
Wow. I mean, essentially what we're finding is that, school choice isn't only about helping students, but there's a huge upside and return on investment for the teachers as well. I guess what would be the, since this is something that would make sense for a lot of teachers to get behind as well as parents, what's the answer to getting this and to having more educational options be a policy that's enacted on the local level throughout the entire country? We can't just wave a magic wand to get rid of unions. We can't wave a magic wand to get rid of special interest groups. What's the answer to having this be more widespread throughout the U.S.?
Well, a recent Supreme Court case, Mark Janus was behind the Supreme Court case from a couple of years ago that actually made compulsory union dues illegal. So if you don't want to pay union dues anymore and you're a public school teacher, you don't have to. You can opt out now. It used to be that in some places there was mandatory dues. So this should reduce the impact of teachers' unions in the future if more teachers start figuring out that they don't have to pay union dues. And I think the argument in the Janus case was that the union dues were going towards political speech that union members did not agree with. And so it was essentially infringing on their First Amendment right of free speech by compelling them to pay for political speech that they didn't agree with. And the union, the teachers union, obviously is inherently a political apparatus. So that's one way to do it. I think another way to do it, though, is to just convince people and just share the facts about school choice, but then just use analogies with people about how it's just completely ridiculous how we structure the school system today. There's no other government program, or most other government programs are not structured this way, where the funding goes to the building instead of the actual individual. With food stamps, the food stamps don't go straight to Walmart and then the government doesn't residentially assign me to my nearest Walmart. I get to take those food stamp dollars to either Walmart or Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, and no one argues about me being able to take those to whatever grocery store I think is best, whether that's and that can be a whole wide range of private grocery stores too. With Pell Grants at the higher ed level, this is also education. My Pell Grants don't go to a community college, and the government doesn't say, oh, you got to go to that community college. No, they let me take the Pell Grant to a public university or private university. Same thing with pre-K programs. A lot of people who argue against voucher programs at the K through 12 level argue for Pell Grants and pre-K programs. Pre-K programs, they let you take those dollars to a public pre-K provider or a private pre-K provider. And I can keep going on and on and on, that all these other programs, we fund individuals instead of systems, and that's how the school system should be. We should fund students, not systems.
So let me ask you this. So what do you think, or to what degree do you think school choice would help to repair some of the disparities we see in educational outcomes for Black and brown students versus white students? Because obviously that's a huge issue in this country. And educational backgrounds, educational experience, educational quality affects future decision making and affects future options that people have for employment, as far as future income earnings and those sorts of things. To what degree would school choice affect and have a positive outcome on changing those outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I only know of one random assignment study that links private school choice to income, and this was actually done in Colombia, which is a disproportionately lower income country, and they found that students who randomly won the lottery to get a voucher compared to the students who lost the lottery. So this is pretty much a medical trial type experiment where you can say it's the effect of the voucher program and nothing else. It's not that the voucher students were more advantaged in any other way. It's just that they got the random chance to win that lottery. And the researchers found, this was a Stanford-based researcher, Eric Bettinger, found that winning the lottery to use a voucher to attend a private school in Colombia actually increased earnings by 8 or 9%, which is substantial if you count that, throughout the rest of your life. So that's the only random assignment study I know of on that. But just from a theoretical perspective, school choice should lead to the best benefits for the least advantaged members of society. School choice is an equalizer in a sense, because rich people already have advantage to the best government-run schools. If I'm a rich family, I can afford to send my kid to a private school out of pocket that costs $30,000 a year. If I'm a rich family, I can afford to spend my money to live in the most expensive neighborhood that happens to be assigned to the best, highest quality government-run school. If I'm advantaged, if I'm a rich family, I'm much more likely to be able to afford the cost of homeschooling. So in that sense, school choice is an equalizer and should only lead to better outcomes and more equality in society, since the least advantaged also are stuck in the lowest quality, worst government-run schools. They need options more than anybody else. And so opponents of school choice will say that school choice is making the rich get richer, or school choice is disproportionately benefiting the most advantaged. But if you look at school choice programs also, even just going beyond the theoretical into the practical, the school choice programs in the U.S. are overwhelmingly targeted to the least advantaged members of society, either based on lower income levels, based on the quality level of their residentially assigned school, and then based on if they're special needs students. Almost all voucher programs are targeted based on one of these three metrics, which in practice also shows that they benefit the least advantaged more than anybody else. But then even then, out of that eligible population of disadvantaged families, it actually, if you look at the data, shows that out of that disadvantaged group, the very least advantaged out of that disadvantaged group tend to apply for the programs. And that's the opposite of what people say in the media. But when you look at the actual data, the people who need school choice the most are the ones who tend to apply for school choice at higher rates than others.
Okay. So how do you, let me ask you this. How do you think the Trump administration has done on the issue of school choice? I know there were pretty high expectations when he appointed Betsy DeVos to run the education department. You know, we have a 3-year track record now of performance. How would you grade this administration on its efforts to implement more school choice options throughout the country?
Yeah, I think Trump's done it right in regards to school choice in that he's used the bully pulpit to highlight the benefits of school choice. I mean, he's mentioned it, I think, in his last couple of State of the Union addresses. He's held roundtables at the White House on school choice. So he's getting people talking about school choice. You know, when Betsy DeVos was appointed, I think in 2017, if you look at a Google trend, you know, you can go on Google and type in like different keywords and see public interest over time. When Betsy DeVos was appointed the same month, Google shows the peak interest of the public in the term school choice and charter schools at that time. And now I will say a lot of people were saying, you know, misinformation about school choice at the time, and they were trying to bash school choice. But I think the school choice crowd, the people in favor of educational freedom, have the better arguments. And I think since then, we've had more and more people actually supporting the idea of having education dollars follow students to whatever type of school works best for them, whether that's a government-run school, whether that's a charter school, whether that's a private school, or whether that's in the home using an education savings account to cover home expenses. I mean, we have a ton of people at home right now because of the coronavirus, right? We're essentially all homeschoolers now. You know, homeschooling is the new status quo in a sense. And after government schools reopen, I think a lot of families are going to be forced essentially to send their kids back to government schools, but they may actually really like homeschooling, and they should be able to keep their children's education dollars to help offset those costs of homeschooling. We spend about $15,424 per year per child in government-run schools in the United States today. Looking at the most recent data, that could go a long way to covering homeschool expenses or tuition at a private school. Heck, we can even just give people 22%, 80% of that, and give them $12,000. That would save the taxpayer money, save the government schools some money. Everybody wins in that situation. But getting back to Trump and DeVos, I do like that they've been talking about it and putting a spotlight on it and getting the public to debate these ideas vigorously, because I think in the end truth wins, and I think truth is on the side of school choice. There is no good reason that students should be residentially assigned to government-run schools. There's in fact no good reason that government needs to run any schools at all. I mean, we have food stamps. We fund food for the least advantaged. We can still have government fund education for the least advantaged, but we don't need government to run our grocery stores. We can have private entities do that. And so I really like, the spotlight that has been put on the idea of school choice, because again, I mean, if you get into arguments with people about the topic of school choice, the other side, either just commits ad hominem right away, stoops down to name calling. They don't use logic. They don't look at the preponderance of the evidence. They'll cherry pick, or if you want to call it lemon pick, the worst studies. And I think at the end of the day, their argument turns into the idea that low-income families, for whatever reason, they believe just aren't smart enough to pick their own schools for their kids. And they don't say that out loud all the time, but a lot of the times they do as well. And I think for the most part, most people in America think that's a ridiculous claim to make and a very elitist claim to make. And so I'm really happy that more people are talking about school choice, because in the end, we're going to win this ideological battle because we have facts on our side.
Now, doesn't a lot of this change have to take place on a local level? Isn't there so much the federal government is able to do in terms of actually implementing school choice policies?
Yeah, I mean, I've read the Constitution, and I cannot find the word education in there, although we still do have a Department of Education for some reason. I'm not sure if that's at all constitutional in a strict sense of interpretation of the Constitution. But I will say that Betsy DeVos has proposed a federal school choice program. and she wants it to be a tax credit scholarship program. So, she argues that it wouldn't be a federal program, that the federal government would just provide additional funding to state level programs that are already in place, and then that federal funding would go to students, and then the students could use that federal funding to go to private schools or to use it towards homeschooling expenses. So in a way, it is a federal proposal, but it's not a federal proposal. It is a federal proposal because, when the federal government gives money, even if it's not regulated right now, future administrations could say, oh, well, we're going to regulate this program in the future, even if Trump doesn't regulate such program today. And then also I like to compare it to the 21 drinking age, right? So the 21 drinking age, this is a federal incentive, essentially, where the federal government gives states some money for having a 21 drinking age, and it just so happens that every single state has a 21 drinking age, even though it's voluntary. I mean, it's kind of not voluntary. So I've actually argued myself against this federal program, even though I support the ideas of school choice, and obviously I'm a huge school choice supporter myself. I just don't think that's the role of the federal government, especially, even if the program looks great today, I'm wary of what a future administration could do and essentially regulate all private schools overnight. So you brought up the idea, though, and I will say that that particular proposal, I don't think it's going to go very far because we have a split Congress, and so I don't think we're going to, going to get really far with that. But again, I think that we're talking about these ideas is what's more important than the actual federal proposals. DeVos has also proposed things called micro grants. And this is kind of like a federal school choice program, I believe. I haven't seen the particulars of the proposal, but it seems like students would be able to, during the pandemic closures, use some of that federal money to offset the cost of home education or private school or virtual school learning during the pandemic. And if that's already using federal money that already exists today through Title I or other federal programs, I think that's actually a good idea to have that existing money just go straight to the families. We're already spending it anyway. We might as well allow for more local control in the sense that the families are controlling the dollars rather than the local school district. I mean, the family is the most local unit of local control that we have available. So I think that would be a good proposal. On the other hand, although I'm not as supportive of that overall federal school choice proposal. And then, like you said, I do think school choice should be a state's or local issue. We've mostly seen that private school choice programs and charter school laws have been passed at the state level. So again, we have 50 states and DC. They're laboratories of democracy. I think that's how it should work. We have that allows us to research, the best ways of doing school choice. That allows people to vote with their feet if they want to, go to Arizona to access better school choice programs. People can vote with their feet and do that right now. That's a benefit of doing it at the state level relative to the federal level. And again, I mean, we have a whole wide array of different types of school choice programs in the U.S. And, one example of why voting with your feet is so important is because Louisiana kind of, I think, did it the wrong way in that they have a highly regulated private school choice program. They require the private schools to use random admissions. They require the private schools to take standardized tests, not just any old standardized test, though. They require the private schools to take the Louisiana state test. They can't pick their tests. And they require the private schools to accept the voucher amount as full payment. So let's say the voucher amount's $8,000 and your school costs, $16,000. You have to accept $8,000 as full payment. And essentially what that means is that school is just not going to participate in the program at all, and none of those kids who could have afforded the difference would be able to afford that $16,000 school. And so the Louisiana experiment actually found negative effects of the voucher program on test scores. And this is the only experiment to date that has found negative effects on test scores in the most recent year of the evaluation. So I think we should do, I mean, this is important because we can learn about how not to do school choice. We should allow families to be the accountability mechanisms, not the government. And then also, real quick, just in Louisiana, I mean, look, with private school choice programs, it's voluntary, right? Private schools can pick whether to participate in the program or not. They don't have to take vouchers if your state passes a voucher program. And in Louisiana, I mean, the regulatory costs were so high, we saw that only a third of the schools chose to participate in the Louisiana voucher program in the first year. In other places, we've seen like 70 to 80% participation rates compared to the 33% participation rate in Louisiana. So what that means is you don't get as many options, but then also you dissuade the higher quality schools from participating. And they found in the Louisiana evaluation that the lower quality schools were the most likely to participate because they needed the money more than anybody else. Regardless of the regulatory structure, lower quality schools will be more likely to participate in these programs. So that means lower quality options for students who need higher quality options the most. The higher quality schools just say, nah, I already have a product that's working for my customers. I'm not going to accept any voucher money because I already have customers that like the way that we're doing things, and we don't want to just recreate the government school system. I mean, people are leaving the government schools to try to get something else. Why do we want to recreate the wheel when people are fleeing those schools in large numbers? It just doesn't make sense to recreate the government school system. I mean, the whole point of escaping that system is to get into a better option.
Yeah. What do you see as some of the biggest misconceptions about school choice?
Yeah. I'm actually coming out with a book that should come out in October. It's co-edited with Cato Institute's Neil McCluskey. He's their director of the Center for Educational Freedom. I actually worked with him when I was an education policy analyst at the Cato Institute, but we still talk a lot today. And we got an edited volume coming out in October called School Choice Myths. And we got invited chapters from various school choice experts across the country, and they each take on one of these myths. The biggest and most pernicious myths in my opinion, is that school choice drains money from government schools. That's the claim that's made. But the reality is that government schools are actually drain money from families. School choice just returns that money to the rightful owner of those dollars. The education dollars are meant for educating the students. They shouldn't be meant for propping up a monopoly system and employing people and essentially being a jobs program. I mean, the point of the education system is to educate children. Those dollars should follow the children. But it gets even worse than that, because in the United States, although schools are funded based on their enrollment counts, I don't know of any state that fully funds schools purely based on enrollment counts. I believe it's around 60 to 80% of funding is determined just based on the number of students you have. So what that means mathematically is that when you lose students to a voucher program, you get to keep 20 to 40% of the funding for a student that's no longer there. So on a per pupil basis, the government-run schools actually financially benefit from school choice programs. Just imagine if, again, I like to use the food stamp analogy, but just imagine if I was shopping with my food stamps at Walmart and then I left to Trader Joe's and Walmart got to keep 20% of my food stamps each week. That wouldn't make any sense. Walmart would be happy about that. Walmart wouldn't be complaining about that, right? Walmart wouldn't be saying, oh, you're draining funding from me. And I mean, the only reason Walmart would be losing any money at all would be because they're not providing the services that I like, and Trader Joe's is providing better services. So my other response to that is that, one, you're financially benefiting from this actually. The thing is, they want to keep 100% of the funding for not educating the student. They want to keep it all. That's the issue here. That's why they're not celebrating keeping 20 to 40%, because they want 100%. That's like me shopping at Trader Joe's and Walmart getting to keep 100% of my food stamp money. That doesn't make any sense. But then also, you won't lose any money at all if your school is actually doing a good job, like people say. People will say two things at one time which do not mesh well with one another, and they're not consistent with one another. The anti-school choice group will say, on the one hand, that government schools are super great and that, you know, they're doing a good job, but then they'll say, oh, school choice is going to cripple the public education system. Well, which one is it? I mean, if your government schools are so great, no one's going to leave. You're not going to lose any money whatsoever. So, I think the best response is that if you don't want to lose any students, do a better job, and those students won't leave. And I mean, that it really highlights the need for school choice, and that they're tacitly admitting that they believe that students are going to leave their schools in large numbers. Well, why do they believe that? It's because they know on the inside they're not providing a meaningful education to a lot of students. They're not providing a safe environment to a lot of students. And that's a tacit admission from the other side that if they believe they're going to lose money, it's because they know they're serving an inferior product.
But yeah, what are two or three other of the biggest myths that you see? Because it seems like the reason a lot of parents and a lot of other people don't fully get on board with the idea of school choice is because they believe things about the damage it's going to have to the education system, the damage it's going to have to kids that, and these things may not actually bear out in real life. So what are some of the other biggest misconceptions that keep people from getting on board this train?
Yeah, so the related topic to the draining funding or draining money myth is that the kids who remain in the government schools are going to be worse off for some reason. First of all, that's not a legitimate argument to force low-income families to stay in government-run schools. Their argument is that if a low-income family leaves to a better school, well, then there might be other people who are worse off. Well, when I take my food stamps from Walmart to Trader Joe's, I don't have to convince anybody that the Walmart shoppers are going to be better off. That just doesn't make any sense. You shouldn't be able to trap me to shop at Walmart. Same thing with Pell Grants. If I take a Pell Grant to Harvard University for a partial scholarship, no one would argue, oh, but you got to go to the community college because, the kids in the community college are going to have less resources and they're going to be worse off. The whole argument just doesn't make any sense. And it's not a legitimate argument to restrict my liberty to pursue a better education just because, in theory, some other students might be worse off. But it's worse than that. The evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the notion that the kids who are left behind in the government-run schools for whatever reason, who don't choose to exercise school choice, actually tend to do better because of school choice competition. There are 27 rigorous studies on this. 25 of 27 studies find statistically significant positive effects of school choice competition on the kids who remain in the government-run school system. The two remaining studies out of the 27 overall find no statistically significant effects on the kids left behind. So there's essentially no evidence of this claim that the kids left behind are going to do worse, or the kids who remain in the government schools are going to do worse. And there's this overwhelming preponderance of the evidence suggesting that, well, actually, when the schools know that they have to compete for their customers, they actually start to change their curriculum. They start to up their game a little bit. And that happens in every single sector in the economy, right? When there's more competition, when customers have the power to choose better products, well, then the other schools or the other competitors actually up their game a little bit, or they shut down if they don't get any better. And shutting down is a feature of the market, not a bug. So that's my response to the myth that the kids left behind actually do worse. The evidence is the opposite. The theory is the opposite. And then also the theory is just bogus, that I shouldn't have to convince you that other people are going to do better in order for me to control the education of my child. And again, this only stops low-income families from leaving the government-run schools, right? Because rich people they pull their kids out of the government-run schools all the time. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, I don't know if you saw that I uncovered that she sent her child, Alex Warren, to a private school in Austin, Texas, and also Pennsylvania. I was the first person who found that at Ancestry.com. But what's funny about Elizabeth Warren is similar to this, that she says that people should just, if they don't like their public schools, they don't like their government schools, they should stay in their government schools and just, work harder to get more funding for it and to make it better. But she didn't do that. She pulled her kid out. She drained money from the government schools when she chose a private school for her kid, because schools are based on enrollment counts. Doesn't matter if you use a voucher or if you pay out of pocket. But again, I mean, all of these arguments, all of these restrictions only apply to people who can't afford to get a better education, right? So these type of rules that are put in place, these protections of the status quo, only force low-income families to keep their kids in the government-run school system. It doesn't force people like Elizabeth Warren. They're still able to afford private schools out of pocket. But the reality is, look, We're already funding education for everyone in the United States through the tax system. There's no reason why that money should not follow the child to whatever type of school that works best for them.
Yeah, it's wild. The people who most vociferously are opposed to school choice, those policies negatively impact the communities that they're supposed to be representing. It's incredibly ironic.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of these elite politicians and academics who oppose school choice, again, they sent their own kids to private schools. In Nebraska, I sent you a couple weeks ago the school choice hypocrisy map. If you go to Nebraska, there's an executive director of the Nebraska Loves Public Schools organization, and she actually sent her kid to a private school, which I'm okay with you sending your kid to a private school, but don't oppose that same option for other people. Elizabeth Warren sent her kid to a private school. Joe Biden, who wants to end all charter schools as we know it and end all private school choice programs, he also sent his kids to private schools. But again, I mean, that's okay of them to do that, but it's hypocritical for them to exercise that choice, but then to deny that choice for less advantaged populations. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And to get on another myth, I guess, because there is an upcoming Supreme Court case. It was supposed to be, I think it's the formal hearing already happened in January. I don't know when they're actually making the ruling, but Montana had a tax credit scholarship program. And the tax credit scholarship program, it was essentially funded by private donations. You could donate to a scholarship granting organization, and that scholarship granting organization could give those private dollars to individuals who apply, who want to, low-income families who want to go to a private school. So it's essentially a privately funded voucher program. And people have argued that voucher programs or tax credit scholarship programs are somehow unconstitutional, and they argue that it's because of an issue with separation of church and state. But the reality is that the Supreme Court already ruled in 2002 in a case called Zellman versus Simmons-Harris that because the dollars go to the family and because the primary beneficiary of the program is the family unit and the child, that and because families can use those dollars at religious or non-religious private schools, separation in church and state is not an issue. The same reason why the GI Bill is constitutional for veterans who want to go to college. They can choose religious or non-religious private colleges. Pell Grants for low-income students in the United States. Those are publicly funded. That's a publicly funded program. It goes to the student. The student can pick a private religious, a private non-religious university, or they can choose a public university as they want. Because people have those choices, it's not a direct mechanism of funding from the government going to the school. Of a religious institution. Same reason why Social Security is constitutional. The money goes to the individual. The individual can choose to donate it to the church, but they can choose to spend it on groceries. They can choose to spend it on other things. So school choice is obviously constitutional. And then in the case of Montana, they have an even weaker argument against the Montana program because the Montana program is privately funded. There's no public funding of private religious institutions at all because they're private donations. And in a recent Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court of the United States said that tax credit scholarship programs like these are constitutional and that these are private dollars because the dollars never come into contact with the tax collector's hands. That's the money quote from the ruling, that private dollars remain private until they come into the tax collector's hands. So again, in Montana is going to win this Supreme Court case because one, they're private dollars, and two, we already have precedent saying that voucher programs as well are constitutional because families can choose.
So what would be if you could just give one final thought or one message to people who still, even with this preponderance of evidence that it works, still oppose school choice, what would be the one thing that you would say to people who are still kind of on the fence about this issue?
Well, my quick answer is that we should fund students, not systems. The money should go to individual families just like we do with all of these other programs, if you want to call it universal basic education income, in order to get you on my side, then we can call it that. But that's essentially what it is, universal basic education income. The only thing is, in the current system, we put all that money into the school system, regardless of how satisfied families are with the school system, and regardless of whether the students actually attend that school. There's no reason why low-income families should have to pay for a private school out of pocket and then still pay for the public school even though their child's not attending that school. There's no reason why that should be the case. And then also, look, you brought up the evidence, and I bring up the evidence all the time, but the reality is, even though the evidence is positive, I should not have to bring you a bunch of evidence to convince you that low-income families should be able to choose their schools. Low-income families should not have to rely on academics to be able to exercise that right. One, a lot of these studies are pretty flawed. Two, these studies are in limited geographical areas. So why should you prevent a family in California from exercising private school choice because a study in Louisiana found negative effects? That doesn't make any sense. Why should I be penalized for the supposed poor decisions of other individuals? Three, these evaluations almost always look at standardized test scores. Families don't give much of a hoot about standardized test scores. They care about things like safety, other forms of satisfaction, cultural education, character education, and a whole host of other issues they prioritize above standardized test scores. They may care about religious education. I'm not a religious person myself, but I understand people's First Amendment right to seek a religious education and to freely exercise their education. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons why people choose schools, and the academics, for some reason, myopically focus on test scores, and then they use those test score results as an attempt to justify limiting the freedoms of low-income families. Because again, we're not limiting the freedoms of higher-income families. Higher-income families already have school choice. So there's no reason why low-income families should have to present academic studies to elites to be able to get permission from academics to be able to exercise school choice. That's just, and I mean, the whole debate has been putting the burden of proof on families as to why they should be able to choose their kids' own schools. That's completely backwards. The burden of proof should be on the government as to why that money should go to the government schools, regardless of whether the kid goes there and regardless of how satisfied a family is with the education that is being provided to their children.
So it sounds like
it's completely backwards.
It sounds like this is really an issue about individual and civil liberties rather than education.
Yeah, totally. And, even if a random assignment evaluation found that on average low-income families pick schools with lower test scores, and if for some reason we believe that standardized test scores were super important and even more important than safety, again, that's just an average effect. I mean, if some other low-income family made a bad choice, and let's just assume for the sake of argument that it was a bad choice, and that contributed to that overall negative average effect, I could have made a good choice. Why are you going to take my right to choose my school away from me? You should have to prove after the fact that I'm making malicious or negligent educational choices for my kids. So it's essentially a big display of elitism and a belief that and an assumption that low-income families, for whatever reason, aren't smart enough to choose schools for their kids. I think that's totally ridiculous, but that's what the whole debate is centered on with school choice. And so, just last message again, that look at the analogies. Look at how we fund almost every other program. Look at how we fund Pell Grants, pre-K programs, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. All of these publicly funded programs go to families, and families can choose their providers. There's no reason whatsoever why government needs to run all the schools. There's obviously no reason whatsoever why families need to be residentially assigned to a government-run school, and there's absolutely no reason whatsoever why that money should go to the school regardless of what school the parent thinks is best for their child. The logical conclusion that we can take from all these other programs is that the thing that's backwards is our current education system, the way we fund our current education system, the way we run our current education system. The way these other programs have it right. that we should fund the families, trust the families to make the best decisions for their own kids, because they care about their educations of their kids, the safety of their kids more than anybody else. They care about these outcomes for their kids more than any bureaucrat sitting in Washington, D.C., who probably don't even know the names of their children. And so we should trust that decision to be made by the parents and not bureaucrats.